Thank you. It's just such an honor and a pleasure to see you all. I wish I was dressed more casually. You never told me about the bloody dress code. I've got such great workout gear over there, and I'm not wearing my sneakers, but I'm in my business suit, because this is what we do in Washington, D.C. But I'm just thrilled to be here and to have this opportunity, and I love your building. I want to take the whole thing and move it to Washington. But what Doug asked me to talk about a little bit are some of the trends that I see in the charitable sector. The perch that I have, one of the greatest parts of my job, is that I get to meet with many, many different kinds of organizations that are part of our sector. Some people call us the non-profit sector, some call it the social sector, some call it all kinds of other things as well, the charitable sector. And it's essentially a group of organizations, some that give funds and some that do the work, and some that do a mixture of both of those kinds of things. But our purposes are common, which is to improve life for others in our communities, in our regions, nationally and globally. And we do it in lots of different ways. Some people provide direct services to folks who are at risk and in need. Others do it through public interest kinds of work. Others do it through education. The higher education system, universities are part of the nonprofit sector. Think tanks are part of it. But groups like the ACLU that do that kind of public interest work are as well. One of my most recent members, I'll just share the story with you before I get into trends, because Doug, you're going to have to one-up this one, and I don't think it's going to be easy for you to do it. As you can tell, I have an accent. I'm from the serious deep south. I'm from South Africa. And one of the members of my board, Mariam Noland, is the president of the Community Foundation in Detroit. So it's the Greater Southeast Michigan Foundation. And part of their job is to encourage people to join IS. So she says, I've got a great member for us. Come to Detroit. So, okay, I trot up to Detroit, and we go drive, and we drive into the zoo. And I said, really? Really? Now, this is a new one for me. So she says, he's absolutely fabulous, state of the art. This is the best zoo. Well, I've never been to any city where anybody didn't say it's the best of the best of the best. It's wonderful. So we go into his office, and he says, don't sit down. We go into a golf cart, and we drive along, and we stop at one of the places where the animals are, and we walk up some stairs, and he gives me some branches, and he says, feed the giraffe. Now, what was it that you wanted to talk to me about? So here I'm handing the branches to the giraffe, and I'm trying to pitch him why he should be a member of independent sector. Now, that was a really weird kind of experience. But the truth is that that's all of who we are, arts and culture institutions. And in the end, if you were to make a film of what our civil society is about and take out all of the organizations that make us up, the million organizations that are part of the United States' civil society network, you'd probably have a blank slate, because we are the texture and the culture and the meaning and the purpose of our communities. And we hold our public officials to account for the kinds of things that they do, and we partner with them. And we also partner, as you know, with the business community as well. Many members of the business community are on our boards, so that we partner in lots of different kinds of ways. So from my perspective, I have an opportunity to see what's going on. And one of the reasons why I love this organization is both because of your mission, but also how you do your work. And just last week, we did a webinar, and there was such a cool intro to the webinar. So can we just show that? It was one of my ways of saying to you, thank you for the way in which you have handled your own crisis. It may be the last one you face, I doubt it. If you are fearless and you try things go in all kinds of different ways. But by leaning into any challenge that you have a chance, and by being willing to admit it and to see if there's a challenge in front of you and to try, that's in fact the way in which you change and move forward, and that people not only are forgiving, but they want to join and partner with you. So thank you, Doug, for your leadership and for continuing to do what you do. When I look at the challenges that face the sector, there are lots of different challenges, and it would take too long for me to go into them. So I was going to mention just a couple to you and then go into them in some detail, but I think I'm going to be much shorter than I was going to be, so that there's a chance for us to have an exchange and a conversation. But I would say that one of the great challenges facing our sector is the ability of our organizations to deal with the flow of information. That the technological revolution has been a great opportunity, but it's also been a great challenge. There was a study done by a McKinsey company of 1,500 Fortune 100 executives of the largest companies in the world. And the majority of them said that the greatest challenge that they face is managing change and keeping up with change, and that the biggest challenge to change was the rapid flow of information. That as soon as one's absorbed it, it's already obsolete. The amount one gets is so much, and making a decision as to what's relevant and important and what's not is a great change. Many of our organizations were created in the last century. The technology and the infrastructures and everything that they have in place, and the pyramid structures that they have, are such that they are not necessarily easily responsive to the kinds of changes that would allow them to take advantage of the newer opportunities. So we have lots of organizations where literally the infrastructure of the organizations is so old that they may not be able to adapt to the challenges of today. So that's one set of challenges. Another one is that our organizations, many of them, are part of membership networks that were created also 30, 40, 50 years ago. And if they were created more recently, they are built on the same model, which is a pyramid structure where connecting to an organization, whether it's regional, whether it's national, whether it's on a subject-specific area, was based upon paying dues in return for a set of benefits. And those benefits might be privileged information that was only available to those members, meeting and networking, access, those sorts of things. And now with the technology revolution that I was talking about, an information revolution, anybody, any place in the world, and without any membership affiliation, could be a 12-year-old kid in Bhopal who in fact is able to access that information. So that the models of these networks haven't changed and adapted in a way that has allowed folks to want to continue to be associated. So that the vehicles through which we network with one another, those vehicles are different. We also find in organizations that folks who are in what I would call the millennial generation, so that's 18 to 35, network very differently than the boomer generation. And the boomer generation are the ones, men very often, who are running a lot of these organizations, so that you have different ways in which people are networking, and we haven't thought about how we deal with these different kinds of these different kinds of structures. Third challenge, big one, has to do with leadership development within the charitable sector. Our sector is third behind business and government in terms of diversity, both with gender and with ethnicity, and that in fact we look least like America in our leadership roles as compared with the other two sectors, and they're not doing so well, but they're doing better than we are. It's interesting as to why, and there are a lot of conversations that we can have about that, and if you want to, we can go into that in much more detail, but that is a major challenge, especially as once boomers, if they ever do leave their jobs, once boomers leave, and there's opportunity for new folks to come in, the generation that are now millennials, of whom I can see quite a few of you in the room, the number of folks who would want to come into the sector and replace those roles aren't enough compared to the number of organizations, and that the competition with public service and government will be quite great. And especially since one of the things said about millennials, not everybody, but as a general observation, is that they are much more sector neutral. So that it's much more about a passion to a cause than it is about the particular kind of organizational framework of working. So this civil society set of organizations, non-profits that have a special tax status and a special role, aren't necessarily seen in the same way as other generations, the X generation and boomers see them, and that is a huge challenge. If you want to talk about any of those three, I'm happy to, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit about three other challenges as well. One is, and probably the greatest challenge facing the charitable sector today, has to do with the widening gap between resources and need. We have grown at twice the rate of the business community for the last 25 years. This last year, we've slowed the rate of growth. Believe it or not, for the last 25 years, there was something like 70,000 new nonprofit organizations created every year in the United States. 70,000. And why is that? Because it's actually not that hard to become a nonprofit organization, and that we have there's an attitude in our societies all around the country that if we see a need and we want to solve a problem, we organize, we get people together, we raise some money, and we create a nonprofit. We don't always do the kind of legwork that maybe would be useful, which is to find out if anybody else is solving that problem and go talk to them. And if they don't want to work with us and solve this, then maybe we do it by ourselves. We tend to want to reinvent for ourselves. That's both good and it's a challenge because it means that you've got lots of operations to support. One of the greatest challenges, though, that we've had is that the rate of money flowing into the sector hasn't kept up with the number of organizations. And when the budget crisis hit and the economy went south for the last few years, that gap widened even further as state budgets stopped funding organizations or stopped funding at the rate that they had before, as federal government dollars flattened out and there was less money, and as individuals in donating to organizations stopped giving at the levels that they had because they were nervous. It's not that they didn't have the money. Lots of them still had the money, but they didn't have the faith that they would have the money because it felt like everything was just too uncertain. And so we found a huge crisis where the rate of growth from the sector was much larger to begin with, and the funding wasn't keeping up, and suddenly it was much further ahead. And add to that, that as a result of the economy and unemployment and all of the problems that I'm sure you've read about, seen, and thought about, the needs went up at the same time. So not only was there less money and more organizations, but in fact the need was greater, so that even had it kept up, organizations were not able to solve this problem. And the result has been, I think, a serious crisis. We are seeing more and more organizations close. We have lots of research, which I'm happy to share with you, about organizations that have less than 3 months of money that's available in reserves to pay for staff. The majority of organizations providing health and human services in the country today say that the contracts that they have with state government to provide these services don't pay for the actual services, so that they are widening their debt all the time, and more than that, that these state governments for the most part are not paying in time. So they pay salaries every month, and yet the reimbursements coming many, many, many months later, and getting bank loans to make up the difference so that they can cover the costs in the meantime are almost impossible to get because of the banking crisis and all of those other kinds of issues. So I would say that the financial crisis facing this sector is so serious and so big that it dwarfs those other challenges that I mentioned to you, which were pretty considerable challenges as well. So that's one that I wanted to share with you just in a general way. There are two others that I want to discuss with you that are different kinds of challenges, and then we can talk about any of these. The second one was born from a very interesting cause that is different than the kinds of things I've been talking about right until now. It was created as a result, I believe, this is Diana's personal opinion, a Supreme Court decision called Citizens United v. the Federal Election Commission. Who's heard of that Supreme Court decision? Anybody? Just raise your hand if you have, just so I can see. So just a handful of you. Citizens United, the Federal Election Commission, which was, I think, about 3 years ago, was a Supreme Court decision that lowered the barriers to participation in electoral politics, meaning the ability to elect people to higher office, public office, and lowered the barriers to participation for corporations and trade unions, which meant that the rules that originally governed how much money corporations, business, and trade unions could put into political campaigns and all of that stuff was limited, and the Supreme Court flushed that out and said, no, these companies are individuals, and individuals can participate. That was basically the ruling. The result has been a massive influx of dollars into our political campaigns in ways that even the most generous predictors, the exaggerators, underestimated. That's how big has been the flow of dollars, particularly from corporations. Now, lots of corporations don't want to use their names to fund particular candidates. Not a big surprise, because if that candidate loses, guess what? The other one ain't going to be so supportive to that corporation. So what would a corporation like to do? Not everyone, but many of them would like to make sure that the candidate they want to win wins, but that nobody knows about it. So in this case, credit is not a good thing from their point of view. So what have they done? They found the perfect vehicle for themselves to use. They created entities that then supported 501c3 non-profit organizations to be the vehicles through which they could do their political activity. Now, why is that a problem? Several reasons. One is that we have a culture in the society and a commitment to making sure that anybody who participates in electoral politics should be public, that we should all know about it. So that if you see an ad, it always says at the bottom, paid for, so that you know who did that and whether you agree with that or not. Sometimes if you know who supported it, you can go, aha, I know where they're coming from. In the charitable sector, we have long believed that donors have the right to confidentiality and anonymity. And the reason for that is, there are many different reasons for it. I just wrote a piece in USA Today last week that made this particular case. And what I said in that piece was that for some religions, the highest form of giving is anonymous giving, is a spirit of generosity. For others, they may want to support an unpopular cause that could, in fact, jeopardize the well-being of their family and their community, because the local people where they live don't like the fact that they support that cause. Just ask the NAACP. There was a Supreme Court decision many, many years ago, many decades ago, and the Supreme Court ruled that donors have the right to be anonymous because of the potential threat to their life and well-being for supporting a cause that may not be popular in a particular community. So that privilege, right? And then there are donors who may not want to share, because if I'm really rich and I give to you, and you think, geez, I also want, then you all then approach me, I might find that I'm overwhelmed, and so I would prefer to give it anonymously for things, so that we've strongly protected that right. We are 501, most of us in the charitable sector are 501c3 organizations that can receive those kinds of donations that are anonymous and so on. C4 organizations also can, except that the donors to C4 organizations can't take a deduction, in return for which C4 organizations, even though they're tax exempt, the donors don't get any deduction, but they can engage in partisan political activity. But they're still protected by their anonymity. So move back to what I was telling you before about Citizens United and this decision. All these corporations have come in, have used C4 organizations or created them, and as a result, the public doesn't know who is funding political activity, which is our right to know as citizens of the United States. Now, all of this has been deeply troubling, and independent sector actually finally took a position on this, and we decided that we need to change the rules and all of that stuff, and we were waiting for the right moment to do something about this subject, and lo and behold, what happens? But somebody at the Internal Revenue Service decides, someone at the Internal Revenue Service, in fact, it's somebody who I know very well, Lois Lerner, decides that she better tell everybody that there's been a bit of a problem at the IRS. And the IRS is the government agency that does oversight, that firstly gives us the authority to be 501c3s and then oversees us. And it's happened that in Cincinnati, one of the national offices that's located in Cincinnati, not in D.C., they had gotten an influx, thousands of, usually they maybe get something like 5,000 or more, as I told you, new organizations. And they got in a period of a couple of months, 2 years before the election, something like 60,000 requests instead of 5. So the local folks, who are not political appointees, they are government employees, decided that they have to create a system to figure out how they're going to decide who can be a C4 and who can't, because they've all applied. And they noticed that a lot of them had the name what in their name? Tea Party. Tea Party. So they thought, oh, we've got a good idea. Why don't we pick out all the ones that are Tea Party and go through those? Because we know the Tea Party is interested in the elections, and maybe they're going to be doing too much electioneering and not the amount that they're allowed to according to the rules. And so they do this, and they continue this for a while, and it then becomes known to Lois Lerner, who's the head of the division of this whole of the nonprofit section for the IRS, and she says, no, you can't do that. That's not a good idea. You need to make it much broader. So they say, oh, okay. So they continue to do that, but they then include others who they think are doing political things. And as a result of this, when she then decides, the reason she decides that she's going to leak the story is because the Inspector General, which is the internal audit arm of the federal government, goes into the IRS and discovers this, and they're about to release their report, and they decide to get ahead of it and to be too smart by half. And so she decides to plant a question among a bunch of lawyers who are talking to her, and this suddenly becomes, voila, a big scandal. So here's an example of an opportunity created from a trend. The trend being that lots and lots of money are going into C4 organizations, creating this cloud and this opaqueness about our public system, of which we have been pulled involuntarily in that direction. And this scandal has created an opening that's blown up this opportunity for us to look and see if there's a way in which we want to rethink what C4 organizations do, what their roles are, the public's right to know, and all those kinds of things. So I wanted to share that one trend with you as an example of how things can happen in a trend-like way, but then an opportunity, which is a huge crisis, but can be turned into an opportunity, is another way to go. Last trend that I'm going to talk to you about, and I'm jumping to lots of different subjects, I've got so many more to tell you, but I won't today, has to do with our own sector. I know what your mission is, and I know what your purpose is, and I know about some of your activities, not as many as I'd like to, and that I intend to find out more about. Whatever it is that you're doing, you're still part of, or what you're essentially a part of, is this charitable nonprofit sector. And our ability to do our work depends on our being able to get funds from people who will support us. And that the government, a long time ago, in 1919, really long time ago, almost 100 years ago, in their wisdom decided that because our purposes, whether you are building bicycle paths for people, or whether you are saving the seals, or whatever it is, or you creating art spaces in downtrodden neighborhoods, whatever it is that you're doing, if you are serving the public good, and that the benefit goes to those in your community and in communities around the world, that you deserve a tax-exempt status. And what's more, we the government are going to encourage people to give by allowing them to take a charitable tax deduction in order to give to you. So that if you were going to give this amount, maybe you'd give that much more because you're incentivized to give. And I get visits from people all over the world, I'm not kidding, all over the world, who want to know what it is about this amazing American civil society where we come together to solve problems, and what is it about that government does that allows us to do this. Now, I might give myself away by what I'm about to say, but I'll say to lots of them, I'll say, well, there are lots of things you don't want to do the way we do it. So I'll tell you about some of the things we do well, but I'll also tell you about some of the things we do really badly, and don't change to do the things we don't do well. And we can have a discussion about what those are in a little bit. But one of the trends that we're seeing lately is some deep questioning by lawmakers about whether this sector still deserves to have this exempt status, and whether everybody in the sector deserves to have it, and whether the rules should be changed. And we can get into the reasons why they decided to go in that direction. It has to do with tax reform and bigger issues. And it also, at its ugliest, it has to do with they're looking for money to pay for other things. And when people get tax incentives to give, it means more money is coming out of the federal treasury. So, the motivations aren't always great. But there are big questions about what is a nonprofit, what is serving the public good, and why should we have this tax-exempt status. And at core are questions like, if you serve the poorest of the poor, should you have a different privileged status than if you are providing arts and culture and higher education? If you've got a big endowment like Harvard University, everybody mentions the multi-billion-dollar Harvard University endowment fund, should you be required to use that in a way that's different and not get the same kind of tax breaks? There are cities saying that there are non-profit organizations that occupy a huge space, and if they're tax exempt, they're not paying taxes, so that the rest of the residents of those cities are not having the same benefits than if they were taxpayers. So maybe they don't even want the non-profits in their cities because they're not paying taxes. So there are lots of questions about who we are and do we deserve to continue to have this special status. And then there are groups within our own universe saying, well, we for-profits and we serve the public good, but we make bucks as well and we earn a profit, so we don't need that. And lawmakers are saying, see, so the for-profit sector is doing that as well. Do you really need us as well? And this is a big trend and a big battle, and it's the one that I probably spend more time dealing with than I ever would want to, but I'm happy to take suggestions and comments. So that gives you an idea of some of the things that I'm thinking about and that I thought I would share with you today. And what I would rather do for the rest of the time is just spend some time taking questions, discussions, and thoughts.
So I'll start with one bit. So obviously huge challenges. Can you talk about, historically, has there, in your opinion, been a time when it's been this potentially drastic in terms of some of these things, the potential deduction going away? Is this something that comes and goes every decade, or is this sort of a new sense that you're getting about how?
Well, two things. When I first came to independent sector, I was telling Doug that I didn't want this job at all because I thought talking about tax incentives, I'm about social justice and changing the world. And tax incentives, I don't think so. And I told the organization, the board that was interviewing me, that I thought that we needed to have strong civil society, community engagement, a re-strengthening of democracy, a social compact with government that was one that was based on values that we believed about our society. And the very first day on the job, I'm not kidding, the very first day on the job, there was an article in the San Jose Mercury News accusing or alleging that one of the major foundations, then the James Irvine Foundation executive, had misused and abused the public trust and had misused the funds in his organization for purposes that were not part of the charitable mission, and had given money to major arts and universities, stopped the funding going to small community colleges. They showed a picture of the foundation that would make any Fortune 50 company, any rich company in the world envious of the view of the Golden Gate Bridge and all of that stuff. Not a pretty picture. And my board decided that they were going to get into these ethics issues. A week later, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, a fellow by the name of Chuck Grassley, who's the Republican from Iowa, said that he was going to regulate the sector. That clearly there was too many problems. But before he said it, there was a series of stories in the Boston Globe, 5 stories, about misdeeds, alleged misdeeds from private foundations. The one that I remember, and I'll tell you the 3 stories, and the one I remember was of one president of a private foundation, which is supposed to give out money to serve the public good, who had used the foundation's money to pay for his daughter's wedding. And then there was a series of stories, 5, in the Washington Post, as they say, above the fold, the part that people look at before breakfast, that alleged that the Nature Conservancy, which is one of the biggest nonprofits in the country, if not in the world, that attends to the care of lands for the protection to conserve our communities, and they often get donations of land that they then, in the end, might sell to support their work, and also because they can't use it. So That's a common practice that they had. But the allegation was that they were selling this land to board members at below market rates without that land being available to be sold. So Chuck Grassley decided that this is the tip of the iceberg, that we're all a bunch of rotten people, and that we have evil in our minds and hearts, and that he was going to regulate us. So I was coming in not to deal with tax incentives, but to the demise of the sector. Thank you very much. And I remember one of the members of the sector who work at the level that I do, at the national level, said something about that there are enough laws in place, that's not the problem, and that what these people are doing, if they're doing it, it's illegal, and that these people need to go to prison. And Grassley got furious, because what does Senator Grassley do? He passes legislation. So if this is an oversight issue, then he doesn't have a role. So he wants to pass legislation. So he said that this is a cesspool. We're a cesspool? Now, that's really colorful language. Smelly language too, but anyway. So I decided to take myself off to meet the staff person who was supporting this. Because if any of you have ever been involved in political activity, you know that it's the staff that help run those organizations, and they're the ones that prepare all these remarks. And I sat down with the guy who was then, by that time, famous everybody. He was the Darth Vader of the sector. His name was Dean Zerby. And I introduced myself to him. I was new. And I said, I want to come and talk to you about how terrible these things are. And he looked at me as if I was crazy, because everybody had gone in to tell him how that's the tip of the iceberg, that's only 2% of the sector, that 98% of us don't do that, and that you can't focus on the cheats, you've got to look at what the do-gooders, and you don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. That was the message. And I came in to say, I want to talk about those cheats and how terrible it is. And he said, what? And he then started giving me stories. And each time he gave me a story, I'd say, that's terrible. That's awful. We've got to figure out a way to fix this. And so we moved, after many, many, many meetings and many bars and drinks and many conversations, we got to the point where we got Senator Grassley and Senator Barkos, who was the Democratic partner, to write us a letter asking us to come back with recommendations as to how to deal with these issues. And we did a whole thing that took a couple of years, about a year and a half, and we turned it around and we stopped them from over-regulating us that would put us out of business. So after that I thought, good, now I can get to my work. And you know, Doug, it is true that from time to time we have bad periods, and we have the economy goes south a bit and north. But I would say that most of the economists are saying that what happened in the last recession was as close to the depression, the 1929 depression, as we've ever had. And that while Wall Street seems to have recovered, thank you very much, Main Street has not recovered. And that the gap in wages, I've got stats in here that are stunning. The rate of growth in poverty here in Austin, the rate of growth in poverty around the country, the gap between rich and poor, the fact that we have more rich people at mega levels and many, many more poor people. And so the changes in our society and the risks that we face are greater. I would say that the other thing that makes it different from now is that there is a non-discussion going on about what is the role of government. Is it government's responsibility to provide for the poorest of the poor? Is it government's responsibility to provide education, and a first-class education, to every child in America? What is government's role? And as you know, and especially being you're a different town in the rest of Texas, but you are part of Texas anyway. You know that in this red state, or mostly red state, that there are very, very, very strong opinions about how robust government should be. And that battle of what is government's responsibility, which is playing out through the big fights that we see between Democrats and Republicans in Congress and the White House and all of that, is at bottom about whose responsibility is it to attend to what kinds of issues. And we, you know, and I'll just give you a teeny tiny example. As part of this tax reform effort that they've started, the House of Representatives, the committee that has jurisdiction over us, is called the House Ways and Means Committee. And they decided that they were going to create 10 subcommittees, working groups, to look at different parts of the tax code. And one group, co-chaired by a Republican and a Democrat, was going to look at the charitable sector. So of course I wanted to go in to meet. I mean, I know these folks, but I want to go in and meet. So I took along the chair of my board, who's the president of Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Stephen Hines, and we sat with Congressman Reichert, who is a conservative Republican from Seattle. A very, very nice guy. And he started off the meeting. I loved the feng shui. We sat in seats, and he first stood like this. I felt like this was chief time. Then he got comfortable, enjoyed it, so he kind of sat himself on his desk with his legs swinging, but he was also much higher than us, looking at us. It was really quite funny. And in the end, he described to us that when he was a young boy of about 15, he came from a very, very abusive home, alcoholism, domestic violence, and so he ran away from home. And that he lived in a car for 2 years. And that if it wasn't for Goodwill Industries, and he mentioned a couple of charities that helped him, he actually wouldn't have made it. He's not sure he would have even survived living, and if he had, he would have been in the prison system. And that was because of those charities that he made it. He ultimately became the chief of police for the city of Seattle, and then for the last 8 or 10 years, or something like that, maybe 12, he's been a member of Congress. So it was his way of saying to us, I love you all. My life wouldn't be what it is without your having helped in this kind of a way. And he said, so I don't want government to do any damage as well. Now remember, this is the guy who's the co-chair on the Republican side, meaning the lead side for the House of Representatives, for the non-profit sector. And so he says, so I don't want government to do any damage to hurt the sector. So since you get most of your money from privately, we just need to make sure that you can continue to get your money privately. Now here are the facts on the ground. The charitable sector gets most of its money, 50% of its money, which is the biggest part. Does anybody know where 50% of our money comes from? Anybody want to take a guess? No, it's fees for service. The fees that we charge people. And remember, the more fees we charge, the more poor people won't be able to get those services, whatever those services are. So arts museums and all of those kinds of things, symphony orchestras, ballets and all of that charge fees. So do counseling programs and blah, blah, blah. So fees for service counts for 50% of our budget. 32% comes from government, 32%. 9% comes from individuals, 9. 2% from foundations and 1% from corporations. He's saying to me, the leader of the non-profits in the House of Representatives, that we get the majority of our money, which if you add foundations, corporations, and individuals together, that's 12%. He's saying that's where we get the majority of our money. He has no idea. And this is the guy who's going to legislate on how to fix us and how to change the rules. And he has been, and this is after 10 sessions learning about the charitable sector. That's the challenge we face. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer. Get me started. And promise I'll be shorter next time. Who?
Go ahead, Lois.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Hi, sorry, I'm actually in Washington, D.C., but thanks very much for your presentation. I'm the Director of Health Policy for the foundation based out here. And I think, you've been speaking to what I would describe as sort of these blurred lines across sectors. So you have governments doing more community-based programming. You have companies talking about the triple bottom line in addition to their CSR work. And I'm wondering whether or not, and maybe it's a bit controversial, but how much should we embrace the sort of bleeding of sectors, or how important is it for us to maintain that distinction? So what are the pros and cons, considering the limited resources, considering the challenges of implementing some of our mutual objectives? What are sort of the opportunities either way for there to be a little bit more, cooperation across the sectors, and maybe even just more formal collaboration, or the ability to kind of, trade some missions or see some missions as just more fluid, than they have been historically.
So let me just describe what some of the benefits are of a tax-exempt organization, just so that you know. We've been having this big fight about the charitable tax deduction recently because President Obama wanted to limit how much money, cap at a certain level, at a lower level than is the current law, giving money to charity that people who itemize their taxes can take. So that's just that's one slice of the money we get.
Right.
So the charitable deduction, we've estimated that if it went away and there was no deduction, that people could just give like you do if you go to some kind of a fair and you just put $5 in or whatever. So it's not, and you generally don't itemize those things, but people who write checks and who itemize their deductions, if that deduction went away, we would lose to the sector about $100 billion. $100 billion. So that's about a third of the money that comes privately to the sector. $100 billion is a heck of a lot of money. So if just the charitable deduction went away, that's not estate tax, it's not any other ways, and I'm not even talking about private foundations and so on. Private foundations, the creation of them, and donor advised funds, which are other streams. Now, it's only 2% of the budget, but for those organizations that depend on private foundations, it's essential, especially the public interest organizations that do advocacy and lobbying. That's where they get them, they primarily get their money from. If those went away, they give out, I don't know, somewhere around $60 billion a year. So we're talking about then 50% of the money that comes to the sector through private sources would go away. Now, could we do just as well on 50% of what we have when I've just talked about the growing amount, say because others are coming in that are doing triple bottom line work and so on? I would say to you, absolutely not. If you look in fields like hospitals, private hospitals, where you've got for-profit hospitals and you've got non-profits, or childcare, or all of those areas, there's a very interesting set of data that we are learning about what is the value of for-profit in that area and what's the value of non-profit. And that the experts, ones who are independent, who don't necessarily have a vested interest in what the answer to that would be, like there was a study that came out of Yale University where a set of professors looked at this on healthcare, and what they found is that in any community it's useful to have for-profit and non-profit hospitals, and that what for-profit provide is very high-end service and a higher quality of service around certain kinds of illnesses that they provide care for. But for-profit hospitals pick and choose what services they provide based upon where they think they can get the best reimbursement. Rich people's diseases, insurance companies' reimbursements, and so on, and that there's a whole range of diseases that they simply don't provide health care for, and they don't have to. They can choose what they provide. And that having, therefore, a non-profit, which may not have as high a quality of service always, it's not universally true, but this is what they found generally, was extremely important because it meant that the rest of services would be available to everybody in that community so that you needed both. So that while a hospital, a for-profit hospital, may have a double bottom line or a triple bottom line and provide some kind of assistance, the business decision and the reason that that organization, that company is in business is to provide a profit for their shareholders. That's their obligation, is to provide a profit for their shareholders. Our obligation is to serve our missions and to provide the public good. And if in the event that we generated more money in 1 year than we consumed in the programs and activities we do, that goes back into our endowment to go out again for allowing us to plan for the following year. So I think that the notion of the charitable sector going away or losing some of its tax protections and privileges would be, I think, a great death blow to organizations, to people living in communities. Now, come to the second part of your question. And I know I'm tackling it in a different way than you asked it, but the second part of your question is basically, what do we think about these kinds of companies that are doing this sort of work, that are working in this space with more than corporate social responsibility, but doing good and doing well and so on. And I would say, bring them on. If there is any company that wants to, like Newman's Own is the most famous example. Paul Newman, the actor, created a salad dressing thing, and he said that all of the profits were going to go to charity. Good for Paul Newman. And if there are more corporations who are willing to do that, good for them. I gave a talk last year in Japan. I was the keynote speaker, or it was the year before, it was just after the tsunami. And I was the keynote speaker at the conference of the Japan Association of Nonprofits. That was similar to what I do. And there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people there. And one of the speakers who followed me made me wish that I didn't speak at all, because he just blew my mind. He was the president and CEO of a corporation, I forgot the name of it, but it was a corporation that provided transportation, truck services, that partnered with companies that, to deliver goods all across Japan. And when the tsunami happened, and they made a profit, and they did fine, they were a very healthy, vibrant company. And when the tsunami happened, the board of directors of that company, and it was a public company, made a decision that they were going to give 40% of their pre-tax profits to help the tsunami. 40%, not 5%, not 2%. Target does 5% of after-tax profits, not pre. But this company did it, and we couldn't believe it. Why would you do that, 40%? And this fellow said that it was because Japan had made it possible for their company to thrive, and Japan was in trouble now, and that it was their obligation to give back. And a funny thing happened on the way to the forum. As a result of that, their company doubled in size and use, and the patriotism of Japanese made them support them by their stocks, and they went through the roof. They didn't do it for that reason. There was no cultural decision to do that. The cultural decision was this was the right thing to do. We don't have that kind of culture here in America. And if we do, it's one person somewhere, someplace. It's not a common thing. And I don't know if it's common in Japan, but I just thought that we should encourage as much triple bottom line as possible from corporations. We should partner with corporations that do that and don't do that. We should engage people on our boards so that they're a part of it. The more people that serve the public good, the better. When corporations build stuff in communities, we should make sure that they are building extra things as well, so that the burden of that company on the use of traffic, or all that, all that kind of stuff, traffic flows and so on, is something that they are part of solving that problem. And we should have the executives of those companies on our boards so that they are part of community problem solving. We should therefore act and be like them, because I think that our serving the public good is a pretty good thing to do.
Sure, that's totally fair. Thanks very much for your response.
One more.
I'm Greg. I'm the finance guy around here. And,
You're the cheap old guy right here?
I am the cheap old guy. That's exactly right.
And in our place, you'd be just part of the
Part of the workforce. Getting back to what you talked about earlier about the number of new nonprofits that are formed each year, the amount coming into the sector is not keeping up with the need. One of the things that I see along that line is the way we collaborate or we don't, and the way funds are used either efficiently or don't. Just follow my logic here for a minute. If there's, at last count, there's 1.3 million nonprofits somewhere around there, depending upon how many the IRS kicks out every year. There's 1.3 million, there's 70 or 75,000 new ones coming in every year. If you took the best scenario, only 75% of that gets really used for purposes that are programmatic, okay? And that's assuming 20% fundraising and 5% for other stuff, but just say 75% of it. So 25% of that is, in my eyes, I don't want to say wasted because it's an investment in other things, but when you have 1.3 million organizations and 70,000 new ones coming in, the total amount raised is not going up. The total amount that's coming into the sector is staying constant. You're still got that 25% that's just wasted. And my belief is that the number of causes that are out there hasn't changed in the last 50 years. We have disease, we have poverty, we have dirty water, we have those kinds of things, and maybe there's 100 of those. I don't know what that number is, but that hasn't changed dramatically over the last 50 years. Yet the number of people trying to provide the service has grown, and we just become less efficient. I know our efforts at trying to collaborate with other cancer organizations and others. What do we do to do that better, to make the process more efficient? Because I think if each of those 100 sectors could do a better job in talking and sharing information and communicating, we could have much more impact with the same dollars that we've got. Whereas right now, we're literally, I don't want to say wasting, but the 25% that's the investment is not going to help people. And the more organizations we have, there's just more money that's funneled that way.
That's true. And I'm going to give you some counter-arguments, but also suggest some ways in which we can address this. Part of the problem here is that when somebody comes up with a bright new idea, I think I said it when I first started, they don't think who else is doing it in the community, let me go and see if they're interested. But I would say the same is true the other way around. If we're busy doing our work, and you read in the paper about somebody who makes some comment, do we call them up and say, come on down and talk to us, so if you're thinking about doing something, maybe we can do it together? We don't proactively reach out either. So whatever happens cooks and bubbles and so on, and before you know it, you have four programs that are opposite, catty corner from each other and competing with one another and not sharing, because when you go to funders, you've got to show how you're different and differentiate yourself as to why you should get the money and not them. So that our funding model almost militates against collaboration. So that's the first thing. The second challenge we have is that in the case of foundations in particular, but I would say with wealthy donors the same is true, they are faddish givers. A really long time gift from a foundation would be a 6 to a 10-year gift. But there are very few foundations that will give that amount to anyone. It may be 3, 4, 5 years and then they're out. In fact, if you don't have a plan to show how you're not going to need their money in the future, they may not give it to you in the first place. So if we constantly have program officers in foundations wanting the new best thing, and somebody who they think is from the millennial generation, because that's going to be where the freshest ideas are, and let's fund them, and they start up and they don't cost a lot, and their salaries aren't very high and all the rest of it, we're depressing salaries, we're doing all of that stuff, and we're doing that. And then we say, this is social innovation at work. This is the best kind of stuff. I'll give you an example of an experience I had on that level that actually boggled my mind. There's a fellow who was the roommate, I'm sure you all know of him, but I'll just say, who's the roommate of Mark Zuckerberg. His name's Chris Hughes, who made maybe not billions and billions, but I'm sure he's worth 600 million if he's worth anything, by the age of 25, right? And he decided to create a non-profit organization called JUMO. I don't know if any of you remember hearing about it. So I decided to go and visit with him and to see what this great thing was. I love innovation and I love young, fresh ideas. It's not that, but I wanted to see, and I want to learn from them and see if we can change our game and our practice and improve. So interaction, I think, is fantastic. And as he was sitting and describing to me what he was doing, it sounded to me like the United Way and what they were doing. And I said to him, did you talk to anybody before you did this? He said, no. And he did no homework. Now, it's not a secret because this is all public. JUMO went under. I mean, it didn't even last a year. It was a year and a half. That guy just had a hell of a lot of money, so the next thing he did was buy the New Republic, and off he is and going. So what I'm saying to you is that I think that to some degree, when funders, in his case he could fund his own, but to some degree when funders prefer new, fresh, young, inexpensive, short-term, they become part of the problem and not part of the solution. And then lastly, I would say to you that our model for collaboration or for doing things together, say saving costs, we tend to think of it more by field that we work in. And Doug and I were having a terrific conversation about your work with American Cancer Society. And I'm thinking, Doug, we got to talk about that at our next conference, to talk about an extraordinary model of collaboration, coming together and figuring out and understanding your distinctive cultures and then being value added to one another. But there are lots of other ways to collaborate that we don't think about. For example, and I say this often to organizations, what if you were to take an old-fashioned radius and do a circle of, and you can do it on, no old-fashioned, do it, oh my God, I've just given my age away. Do it through technology and look at which non-profit organizations are in a 5-mile or 10-mile catchment area of yours. Go and visit all of them, convene a meeting and say, why don't we look for shared HR services, shared this, shared that, and at some point let's look for a common space together. We're not competing with each other because we're in different fields. One of us works with kids, another one works with animals, whatever we work with. And let's share backroom operations together. Let's learn from one another. Let's pool those kinds of resources. And then if our rents and mortgage, whatever it is, come up at the same time, maybe we can even move in together. We don't do that. So by geography, the beauty of that is that you then have a city or a community of organizations who know one another across fields, and then there are unlikely opportunities for collaboration. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing I'd say, and this is highly self-interested what I'm about to say, so I'm warning you in advance, and that is that I don't think we send enough people to meetings where they can meet one another and learn from one another so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel. The beauty of my experience, of my own life experience, is that I get to go to visit communities and I learn about the amazing things people do, and then I run back to Washington and say, oh, they're doing this and this and this, and let's feature them at the conference and so on. But what if we made sure that in your communities you had more community gatherings to learn from one another, and not within the same field, and also come to conferences like ours, because in there is an opportunity for idea exchange that people don't have to create from scratch. So I think we've got the solutions within our reach, but we don't focus in a way that would help us to get there.
Thank you very much. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you.